Thank you everyone for joining. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Ruby Koch-Feinberg. I'm the Agriculture and Food Systems Coordinator at Cornell Cooperative Extension, Putnam County. I want to give a little bit of an introduction about CC Putnam for those of you who are joining today, but are not familiar with our organization. Just Cornell Cooperative Extension, our mission statement, so bear with me, puts knowledge to work in pursuit of economic vitality, ecological sustainability, and social well-being. Our main areas of focus are agriculture and food systems. We have 4-H youth development, and then environmental, horticulture, and natural resources. And I believe Jen is on this chat today. We are really excited to be offering this winter farming workshop series. This is the first session. Next Thursday's session is on agroforestry with perennial forest floor crops and fruit-bearing trees, taught by Jen. And then the following week's presentation is on the 18th, which is beginning sheep and goats. And I'll put all of those links to join if you would like to register for those also. During the session today, please remember to keep yourself on mute and feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box along the presentation so we can refer back to that chat box at the end. We've saved 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, so we can be sure to answer any questions that you all have. And I'll be sending out the presentation after the class for you to refer back to. I have a really brief pre-program survey before we get started. If I will throw that in here, pre-evaluation. If you could just fill that out, that would be incredibly helpful. I'll give you some time to fill it out. That just helps us with the data on the back end. So thank you for those of you. As that is getting filled out, I'm just going to briefly introduce Laura McDermott. She will be giving the presentation today on growing small fruits. She's been, I did the math, working with CCE for 35 years now. She's a senior extension associate with Cornell Cooperative Extension Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program, where she serves as the team leader and small fruit specialist. Laura has years of experience troubleshooting commercial fruit and vegetable production problems and has worked with many new growers as they establish their farms. So I'll just let anybody else answer the questions, and we will just go ahead and get started. So I'm going to close it. 3, 2, great. Thank you, everyone, filling that out. And Laura, off to you.
Thanks, Ruby, for having me, and thank you all for joining us for this nice little lunchtime. I love the lunchtime format. It's great. I'm going to just start my presentation, and then is everybody seeing that correctly? It's filling the whole screen.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. All right, so this is an older, this presentation has been updated a whole bunch of times, but it was originally put together by Lori Brewer at Cornell University. And it's based on this book, this Cornell Guide to Growing Fruit at Home, which is based for home gardeners. And I know that this is a group of, hopefully new farmers, which I think is wonderful. And, sometimes the scale is actually quite similar. So I've reconfigured this slightly, and we'll talk a little bit about the things that a farmer might need to think about more than a gardener. But the premise here is that you will be able to you'll be able to actually sell some of this fruit. Hold on, for some reason it's not advancing now. There we go. So this is my email and my office phone number, and you're welcome to call me. I have been working with Cornell Cooperative Extension for a number of years. Right there, I'm looking at a fruit sample for spotted wing Drosophila, and we'll mention that pest. But I do want to kind of, this is all berries. We're not going to talk about tree fruit, even though I do cover that in my Master Gardener presentations. But the thing about growing fruit for either for your own home consumption or for sale is that it's a very dynamic, it's a very challenging kind of gardening kind of thing. These plants are perennial, so they need to be sited correctly. And I'm going to kind of hammer that over and over about understanding your soil and understanding the site specifications of a perennial fruit crop. There's a lot of things to remember. And the reason that berry crops are really, first of all, they're delicious. And secondly, they have a lot of nutrients that are looked for by our consumers, our customers. Antioxidant, the appropriate antioxidants that are in a lot of dark colored berries is huge, and becoming more important as people understand how they work with free radicals in our bodies and help prevent inflammation. And so it's not just the nutrient content, but it's also the action of some of those antioxidants in those darker colored fruit especially, but all berries have a good amount of antioxidants. So it's really helpful for diets, and the fresher the fruit, the more nutrients we have. And obviously the flavor is really important to most of our customers. We aren't going to talk a lot in this presentation about pesticides. There might be a brief little mention of them, but this is definitely going to kind of talk about what you might come up against from a pest situation and some of the more sustainable ways that you can control those pests. But by no means are we going to really dig that deep into pest control, because it is a big lift, and this is only an hour and a little bit of a presentation. So thinking again about how you can be successful. And I think one of the biggest things is to plan ahead, and you're already doing that by attending this lecture, to try to get your toes wet a little bit to what this means to actually grow berry crops. And then understanding the site requirements of these plants, because again, they are perennial. We do talk about strawberries, which are kind of what I call kind of a semi-perennial plant, but most of them will be productive for a decade at minimum. And if you're talking about blueberries, it could be 60 to 70, 80 years if you can get that site selection right. Starting small is important because it's easy to get overwhelmed, and that's when things kind of start to go sideways a little bit. And then a bit about soil preparation. And again, Cornell Cooperative Extension in Putnam County and across the state, along with other land grant universities, have lots and lots of resources that are mostly online now. I must admit that we have moved away from hard copy things, and that's too bad in some respects, but everything is online, and you can really get a good bunch of information that way. And we're going to look at the Cornell Fruit Resource website at the end of this. Okay, so matching plants to your site. And this is a picture of a commercial vineyard in the Finger Lakes. And the thing I like about this is that it really tries to describe what a perfect, quote unquote, perfect situation for temperate fruit crops is. And that body of water, whether it's one of the Finger Lakes or Lake Champlain or the Hudson River, or even something smaller like a small pond or lake that's near you, the benefit of that is that that body of water acts as a heat sink, so that it not only keeps it warmer in the winter, but it also helps it stay cool in the summer. And in our region of the country, that's pretty important. Becoming less important about the warming in the winter because we are having such warm winters, but certainly from the perspective of keeping it a little bit cooler in the summer, it really is helpful. And that terrain where you get that slope so that you do get cold air movement. We'll have another slide about this, but cold air settles into hollows, and that's called frost pocketing. So this kind of sloping terrain is also quite helpful. But don't despair if you don't live along a body of water or something. You can certainly, there are other things to think about. And this, I apologize. There is just a brand new USDA map, and I haven't gotten my hands on it yet. This is the crazy thing about what's happening in our weather. You know, I worked probably almost 2 decades before and it hadn't changed for 2 decades prior to that, the USDA hardiness zone map, and now it's changed twice in the last couple of decades. So we're definitely seeing these annual extreme minimum temperatures are rising, lessening, so that means that our hardiness zones are and this is the part you can't really say predictably, because we are still having a lot of erratic temperature dips in both the spring and the winter, which kind of causes some real challenges for growing some of the tender temperate perennial crops. But this, it just gives you an idea of what you could probably get away with as far as if you have a good site. And most of you folks are down in that 6B, maybe even 7A, depending upon your location, 6A, a little bit. So you get a lot more capabilities of growing things, you know, just as much as out on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. It really makes a big difference to what you're able to successfully plant and fruit. And then there's a typical spring and fall frost. These also are changing. I don't know if there's anything typical about spring frosts anymore, but we certainly have seen a lengthening on the fall side of things. Our growing season has gotten progressively longer. And what that really means is it kind of gives you an idea of what you can expect for the seasonality or the length of the season that you can get certain things ripened. With berry crops, I don't think there's a single crop that you couldn't get ripened in anywhere in New York State, really. They don't need a lot of heat. They do quite well in cooler temperatures. But if you were going to grow a tree fruit and you wanted to put a whole bunch of Granny Smith, let's just say, in, you definitely would want to make sure that you had it in one of the warmer locations, because that requires a fair amount of heat to get some good quality fruit. And this is just a little schematic of what I'm talking about when I refer to, let me see if I can get a little pointer here. So when we talk about frost pocketing or you know, freeze pockets, this kind of gives you an understanding of it. So if you've got even a little tiny dip, even a foot different in elevation, cold air always is heavier and it settles down, it moves down, especially if it's a quiet night. So if it's a quiet night, that cold air is going to settle as far as it can. As it settles, it pushes this warmer air out. And as that warmer air kind of moves past on that slope, whether it's, you know, 100 feet or whether it's, you know, 6 inches, it's still going to move that air past a little bit and create a better on the slope. I mean, obviously 6 inches doesn't take very long. So the inversion will happen pretty quickly. But if you've got a bigger slope, that inversion is going to keep progressively over the time, the duration of that cold air settling. It'll help successfully keep this air moving around. And some of you have seen probably as you go past orchards in the Hudson Valley, they'll have air turbines, or some people hire helicopters, those wind machines. They'll even have fans that they'll move through the orchard. You know, when they build fires and smudge pots, sometimes it's less about the actual BTUs that are given off and as much about just trying to get that air moving. And when you've got kind of a change of temperature from one spot to another, it does help keep the air moving and keep that cold air from settling. So that's just understanding microclimates on your property. The other thing that's interesting about microclimates is historically, we've usually, but not always, had our weather come from the west, and it kind of moves across the country, and then we can kind of watch it almost happening. We're having a lot more of nor'easters that are coming up the coast. So that is a little interesting to be careful and really watch where your weather is coming from. Because if it's coming without like this storm surge, and it's just kind of creeping along, if you have a hedgerow that prevents that air from moving, that cold air from moving, you could have a frost pocketing right on that side of the hedgerow. So say if you were watching a storm kind of move, this weather pattern move across the country, and you've got a big hedgerow that runs north-south, you've got this westerly flow or easterly flow of air coming from the west, and it kind of gets blocked up. And so I wouldn't plant, I'd be kind of cautious about planting my really tender plants along the west side of a definite hedgerow that's going to slow things down, or even on the south side, which again is really not, it's counterintuitive, right? You think, oh, if it's got a south or a western faced aspect, it's going to be so much warmer, but it's that fluctuation in temperatures that are really something to be aware of and careful about siting. Does anybody have any, I'll try to ask this question a little bit, but does anybody have any questions about that? Because soil is important, but this situational siting is also really important. And I don't know, Ruby, if you want to let them unmute and just ask their question, or just put it in the chat box. However, let me read. There is a question. Okay, it's from Ruby. Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so one of the other things to be aware of is that a lot of times plants have a hard time setting fruit. And this is, again, thankfully, less of a problem for berry crops, although there's still some situational issues than it is tree fruit. And tree fruit are definitely more difficult, I think, to grow, and some of this part is applicable to that. But the age of the plant, the only one that really this is an issue is blueberries. Blueberries do take a while before they get to a mature age. Winter injury, that can definitely, as we kind of have this warm temperature, and then all of a sudden we might have some very cold temperatures that come in, you can get some damage there. You can get damage from late spring frost, which kill buds and both fruit buds and vegetative buds. If you get cold or rainy weather or lack of cross-pollination, we'll talk about some of that again in blueberries, you might get inadequate pollination and therefore poor fruit set. And then poor plant nutrition or management and disease, insects also, some of these things will have impact on fruit set. And then again, considering the site. So do you have adequate sun? Even what we call understory plants, which blueberries, some ribes, they all kind of, they're in this kind of understory category. They still do best if you've got at least 8 hours of sun. You definitely want adequate space, good air circulation. These plants have very shallow roots, so they have to have access to water. And if you have a real tight situation where you don't have good airflow, you're going to have more problems with diseases. And whenever you have stress plants, you're going to have more insects. And wildlife, certainly, for all of us in Eastern New York, I feel like especially just because of the way we have lots of cover, especially for deer, it's a great thing, right? It's a great problem to have because we want wildlife, we want birds, we want lots of different insects. But sometimes that can be a problem if you're trying to grow a crop for profit. And so those are just some things to think about. So again, starting small, this is some of these charts and things are actually in that original book that was on the front, the very first slide. You can get that for free. Well, you can download that and I'll show you the website where you can go to poke around for tons of information. And this is included there. But this just gives you some, here's the juvenile period, 2 to maybe 6 years, depending upon what the crop is before they start getting really productive. Here's some general spacing guidelines, potential yield at maturity. And this is where I really, this is especially for grapes and for apples. You can get a lot of fruit off one plant and you got to be aware of that and ready for it. Not so much a problem for berries. And I dare say that you could sell every berry that you grow because we don't have enough berry growers, commercial berry growers that are local. But this also gives you an idea of the harvest period. And we have a lot of ways that we've changed. We've moved the harvest period for some of these berry crops. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. And then this is something, and I will show you a resource, a very comprehensive resource for berry growers specifically, but doing soil tests, making sure that you do a nutrient test, which is this little box. This is a pH test, and then this is a complete nutrient analysis. We need to know your soil pH, very important for blueberries or acid-loving plants. And then we also, it would be great to know the major and micronutrients, where that is, and also the organic matter. Really important to your success. And if you have a disturbed site, which possibly many of you do, soil compaction is going to be an issue. Understanding soil is a huge thing. And if you feel at all like, what is she talking about? That tells me that you should you should read some more about soil, because that's going to be your most important first thing to do if you're starting out a farm. Growing a cover crop. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say the words cover crop, you really need to read about this. What this is putting a crop in that is not something that you sell, but its total purpose is to enrich and enhance the soil that you're going to be growing your crops in. And we try to encourage farmers not to have any bare soil, keeping a soil covered during the growing season and also during the winter helps reduce erosion. It helps you add organic matter back to that soil. It interrupts pest life cycles. This particular one that's shown here in this little tiny raised bed is buckwheat. It's not a wheat at all. It's not a grass plant, but it's a really terrific cover crop because it grows very fast. It's inexpensive. As long as you get it before, as soon as it starts flowering like this, if you cut it and incorporate it and then reseed, you can get 2 to 3 to even 4 sowings of buckwheat in a season. And that just does a tremendous job at helping to smother out weeds. And it adds a little bit of organic matter, and it really is helpful. But there's lots of other cover crops. So one thing, I do have a little note here, bird seed. Some people will look and see millet mentioned as a great cover crop. It is, but don't buy millet that's meant for bird seed, or actually anything that's meant for bird seed, because it is not analyzed for the percent of weeds in it. It's just sold, which helps, maybe helps you understand why sometimes under your bird feeders you get some really weirdo weeds, right? It's because that bird seed can be kept from anywhere in the world, and it's brought in. It's not looked at for how weed seed free it is. It's just a source of animal food for birds, which can create some problems. Anyway, it's just a little fun fact. And so the most productive years for your home fruit garden or from your new commercial enterprise is those first years before planting. All of the planning, all of the soil prep and siting will help you actually get some really good products. I'm going to talk just very briefly about pruning because these are essential to certainly blueberries and caneberries. Bypass shears, loppers, probably not too often. Maybe sometimes for some blueberries, you'll need a pruning saw. You probably won't need a pruning pole because you're not going to be going up high. You'll just need to know how to care for these instruments or these tools, but you don't want to use an anvil type pruner that has that one dull side. That's really for only herbaceous plants, not for woody plants. And then if you're really going to go into certainly for blueberries, because that wood can be very hard and very difficult, I would encourage you to consider some of these newer battery powered pruning shears. Some of these are quite expensive. They're really great, but they are, $1,000 or more for these backpack pruners. And then you can get some less expensive from the big box stores that have a shorter battery life, but do almost the same as far as the size of the branch that they can cut. And the reason that this is important, A, none of us are getting any younger, and B, if pruning is easier, you will do a better job of it. You will do more pruning, and the more pruning you do, the better it is for the plant, because pruning invigorates a plant. Young wood is the productive wood primarily. Old wood, not productive, and it needs to get out of there. And we will talk a little bit more about that specifically with blueberries and caneberries. So now we're going to touch on strawberries. And again, the other thing that I don't know if I have a picture in here, the other thing to really keep in mind from a commercial perspective is that berries are extremely perishable. And so you need to have a cooler. And whether it is a cooler that's run by one of those cool bots, which is connected to a home window air conditioner and overrides the thermostat, so it allows you to keep it much cooler in an insulated room, or even, I work with farmers who have taken, old stables and insulated a stall, put a cool bot in there, and it works great. So something like that, it's really important. And then if you get larger and you really want to hone down, it's great to have an actual cooler, because a cool bot, you can't address the humidity. So it's humidity and temperature that's important for post-harvest care of these perishable fruits. But most of them, the best way to handle them, especially strawberries and raspberries, is to sell them as quickly as you can. You don't want to keep a strawberry sitting around at your place for more than a day. You want to get them to your buyers. All right. Let's see. So there's a couple of different types of strawberries. And if you're going to go into strawberry production in a big way, I would say that you're definitely going to want to grow June bearing and day neutral. The everbearing is usually what we refer to as the alpine strawberry. It's much smaller. It does bear longer. It's actually the parent of the day neutral strawberry. And it's not really day length that infers the generation of new buds or the production time. It's just temperature. So they'll start producing flowers and fruit as soon as it gets warm enough for them to do that. And usually they are alpine. There are, if you're thinking about a high-end buyer, some restaurants I know in New York City, I get calls fairly frequently about trying to locate those little feuilles de bois, those tiny little strawberries that are super sweet. And we have only one commercial grower that I'm aware of in New York State that's doing that. Very time intensive, but very profitable. So that could be a niche. But strawberries in general, I mean, there are fewer and fewer strawberry growers because it is a challenge. And that I think there's a lot of promise for strawberries. So June bearing cultivars, and I don't want to go into this, there's a lot. So June bearing are what we think of as our spring berries. They're grown in matted rows. Many of us as children remember going to, you go strawberry picking and then you make jam and you do all kinds of preservation type things. It's harder to find a strawberry farm now. So those activities, and I think, there's just not that many people making jam or preserving things, but that used to be a really big cultural thing. These varieties they are triggered by day length. So they're also called short day plants. So as the day length gets shorter in like September and October, that's when that plant is laying down all their buds for the following spring, which usually mid to late May into June is when they're really kicking it in. And they have there's a lot of fruit all at one time. It's usually each variety bears for maybe a week to 2 weeks. And that's why in order to get 6 to 8 weeks of production, you have to have 6 to 8 different varieties so that you're getting an early season, an early mid, a late, then we have really late ones now. The fruit quality is exceptional in these. It's a little softer. So these are not the varieties that are being grown that you'll find in the supermarket. Absolutely not. They have a completely different flavor range. And some of these resistance to some of these leaf diseases and root diseases are also quite different. And we have something like Jewel, which is a phenomenal tasting and looking berry. It does have some problems with root diseases. So we're doing a lot of work to try to figure out how to manage those root diseases. It's soil borne primarily, that's the problem. And you can do things to manage around that, like rotate your crops, make sure you're using cover cropping in between, rest the soil for quite a few years after you've had these varieties in there so that you don't have a buildup of that inoculum. So again, evaluating your site, making sure you don't have a history of soil-borne diseases. It's really hard for a home gardener or a brand new farmer to figure all of that out. But if you're buying ground that has been cropped, making sure you know at least the last 3 to 5 years of cropping history would be helpful. If you notice that your soil tends to be a little bit wet, that is a big warning sign because all of these plants like to have very well-drained soil. And some of the reasoning of that, even though they like to have a lot of water available to them, they don't like to have what we call wet feet, because when you have soils that don't drain well and it's heavy and you get a fair amount of standing water sometimes, that is when we have problems with some of these soil-borne diseases. For strawberries, the soil pH needs to be approximately 6.2. There needs to be a little bit of nutrient amendments that happen prior to planting, making sure to eliminate perennial weeds as best as possible, and increasing the organic matter. With strawberries, usually because we're using straw as an inter-row mulch or winter mulch, usually we get pretty good organic matter over the years, so that's a nice thing to know. But more and more people are moving away from straw as a winter mulch and using row covers. We'll talk about that. So that may result in having a lower organic matter over time. So these plants are usually purchased as dormant crowns, and they come in these bundles of very unimpressive looking plants. There's probably 25 plants in this bundle. When you plant them, you want to look for any kind of sliminess or smelliness. And if you cut them open and it has this really dark spot right where that growing tip should be, that means that you probably got some pretty serious winter injury, which is usually from the cooler. And so that's why planting early is good, because these plants are dug usually in the fall, the late fall, then they're cleaned up and examined and stored in a cooler all winter. So December, January, February, March, April. I mean, we don't want to go into the summer to plant these because that just means longer and longer time in the cooler. And that's just something you want to look at. And then correct planting depth with strawberries is important. You want to make sure that soil is right across that top of that a corky cortex right there. And then if the roots are too long, it's okay to go ahead and trim them. I'd still like to see a good 6-inch root, but if it's sometimes they come and they're 8-10 inches long, you can go ahead and trim them. The worst thing is to have what we call J rooting. And that's where you dig a pretty wimpy hole that's only about 3 or 4 inches deep, and you try to stick those 6 inches roots down in there, and you crimp them back up. So they're essentially forming a J in the hole. That will cause lodging, and the plants do not like that. So just be careful. Make sure you've got a nice deep hole, that the roots are not folding back up on themselves, and that would be super helpful. Okay, so you're purchasing the plants in the winter, planting, then you give a little bit of fertilizer just to get them started, and then weed all summer long. This is for the matted row ones, right? We don't have plastic mulch. You can use plastic mulch even with these June bearers. But if you're just doing a matted row like this, you're going to have to try to keep the weeds out of that bare soil, which is really tough. And then you give them a little more fertilizer in the early fall, and you're going to put that mulch, whether it's straw mulch or row cover, over to protect the plants. These strawberries never go fully dormant. They have this kind of semi-dormant. So as soon as they really get dormant, that's a good thing, but they'll pop right up out of dormancy. So that's when that's why the straw or the row cover is used, is to try to keep them dormant. Because if we get a cold snap, then in 2 weeks we get another warm trend, and then we get another cold snap. That just means that plant keeps getting heaved up out of the ground, and you can get some real damage. The fertilizer is, that's something that you'd really have to focus on. And because this is 10-10-10 is a not inorganic fertilizer, there are lots of things that you can preload, and then it decomposes slowly, so that the plants, you don't have to keep coming in there and side dressing with a synthetic fertilizer. You can actually use some of the organic fertilizers and do that preloading. And it does need a little bit of water, 1 to 2 inches of water every week. The following year is when you're going to get fruit. You do want to have frost protection or some kind of plan, whether it's a row cover or irrigation, to protect these blossoms for that second year when they're actually going to be bearing fruit. And then one of the big things for these matted rows, this is matted rows primarily, although if you're growing June bears on a plastic mulched row, you're going to want to still clip off the plant. And the reason you do that is just to kind of get rid of inoculum. You want the new runners to come out, to put new crowns in the ground. And when you've got a matted row, which is kind of that typical northeastern way we do it, you've got a row that's about 12 inches wide. You're going to want to thin that up, throw a little bit of soil up to cover those crowns, and that'll help that planting really make it through the, that we can get 3 to 5 years of good cropping on it. So the big problem with these matted row, if you haven't figured that out, is that initial season, that first season of weed control. And that's why plastic mulch has been brought in to be used a lot. So after the planting year, you've got this kind of, you're doing this tilling, renovating it, then you're throwing some straw on them. Get 3 to 5 years, I would say, if you're really kind of honing it well. I know growers that have fruited their June bearing plants for up to 8 years and still quite decent. So it isn't, doesn't have to be just 3 years. Now, organic growers mostly fruit for just these June bearers. If they're doing a matted row like this, they mostly fruit for only a year. because they just can't control those weeds. So if you're not using an herbicide and you also are trying to protect your ground, you've got a really good rotation, you may only decide to fruit for just one season. All right, so let's talk about day neutrals, which are the cross between a June bearing and an ever bearing, and that is primarily what we're eating when we purchase strawberry fruit that's being grown in California and Florida, anywhere in South America. It's all these day neutral varieties. They tend to be firmer. I personally think their flavor is getting much better, but it's still not quite as good as one of the June bearing varieties or many of the June bearing varieties. And these plants don't like it to be hot, which is why a lot of growers are growing them on plastic mulch. They don't have as many runners as the June bearing varieties do, so they don't form a matted row that well. So it works really well with these covered rows. And then this grower has actually used landscape cloth in between so that they don't have to worry at all about weeds. Because weeds, even though weeds, you may think, oh, those little bit of weeds isn't really causing that much problems. Weeds are, they harbor insect pests. They do a fair amount of damage, and they can accumulate very quickly. So weeds are problems. And a lot of organic growers are really trying to move away from tillage. So that used to be the answer, but now we're using tarping, we're using this row cover kind of thing, this landscape cloth cover, soil covers, to keep the soil covered so it doesn't erode. I mean, that wouldn't be a problem in a nice flat field like this, but it also just does help you with weed control. And the difference between a day neutral variety is that you're putting it in the ground and you fruit that same year. So fruiting would start in the spring of the year or the summer of the year. It would go all the way into almost Thanksgiving. And then you might go ahead and try to put a little, maybe use some row cover or something. Most growers will fruit again in the spring because they'll start producing as soon as the days get long. And then they'll take a little rest at probably mid-July, and then they'll fruit again. But fruit size really does fall off in these varieties very quickly. So usually they fruit that first year, then they fruit again the second spring. Usually by then, the planting is ripped out, and it actually works quite nicely in a vegetable rotation. And here's just some other pictures of things that you might want to employ on your own farm. These are called these little low tunnels, kind of caterpillar tunnels, but they're even smaller than a caterpillar tunnel. That helps keep the rain off of the plants, and which really does help with disease control. A lot of these materials also prevent some of the UV light that is a trigger for certain pathogens. So that in and of itself also helps keep the fruit cleaner. Botrytis is a real problem for strawberries, and these plastics have UV light filters that help prevent those spores from germinating, botrytis spores, and powdery mildew spores. So this is a picture of Rime that's been used for mostly for frost protection. So they obviously use straw, and they rake the straw off, and then they use these large sheets of row cover to give them 4 to 5 degrees of protection from spring frost. And that was pretty useful this past spring, although it was such an intense frost and it was windy. The row cover really didn't do that well for that May 17th freeze that we had in 2023. So just very quickly, so these are a couple of soil-borne fungal diseases that we struggle with. This is verticillium, causes a rapid collapse. It's ubiquitous in our soils. We almost can't get away from it because it has so many hosts that kind of keep it propped up in the soil. Red steel is a common name for Phytophthora. That's a water mold that is a real problem in heavy soils. Then we have things like botrytis and gray mold and leather rot. Those are fungal fruit problems. And then tarnished plant bug causes these button berries. That's a easy to control insect because you can use row cover to keep it out to actually provide a barrier. And then there's some things that are problematic, but they're not like the end of the world. Bud weevil and spittlebug. Spittlebug actually doesn't do that much damage, but pickers don't love it. So if you're doing a U-pick, that can be a problem. And bud weevil has become a little bit more of a problem for growers, but still it's not a huge issue, I don't think. Probably one of the biggest pest problems are slugs. And slugs are super difficult to control. There's all different, this is a little beer. Beer is commonly tossed about as being a real copper wire or copper tape, diatomaceous earth. But one thing really it's a product called Sluggo. It's iron phosphide, and you can sprinkle that around, especially helpful in the fall when these animals are laying their eggs in the soil. So you want to get that material out as quickly as possible. So in the fall, as these eggs hatch and you've got small slugs, they will hopefully die from it. And Sluggo is an organically approved material. Okay, so I spent a lot of time on strawberries, and now we're going to talk about brambles, which are caneberries,
Hey, Laura,
raspberries, and blackberries. Do we have any questions about strawberries before we move?
there's some in the chat, so I'll just let you answer those.
Okay, so deer-resistant plants. I don't know of any, Lance. Daffodils. I don't, honest to God, there's no real good way to, I don't know many deer-resistant plants. Sorry about that. None of the plants that I'm talking about here are resistant. So best way to eliminate perennial weeds. I think trying to do a full season of cover cropping is one of the very best ways, because you want to try to weaken so say, let's say you have something awful in there, like what's a really bad perennial weed? I'm blanking out here, but so the problem is that perennial weeds survive because they have a really good root system. So you have to weaken that root system by constantly cutting or tilling. And you have to also keep the germination of weed seeds that they may be built up. So ripping them out, covering them, constantly adding cover crops to outcompete them is one really good way. Using those landscape cloth judiciously. And the one thing I really don't like landscape cloth to be used as is to put it down and then put organic mulch on top of it and think you're all done. That's real bad. So strawberries and root diseases, is that why people often plant and raise beds? Yes, better drainage, less standing water. Definitely that's why that happens. Managing chipmunks. I think that we're first of all, you have to get rid of the ground cover for chipmunks. This is not a wildlife class, so I don't have every answer for chipmunks, but other than you really should manage them. I think basically for small rodents like voles, chipmunks, you have to get rid of that ground cover. So if you've got tall grass, if you've got hedgerows, if you've got things placed at rock walls, all of that are places for them to hide, and they will stay away from, natural predators like birds of prey. I mean, I could go on and talk about things that are probably less appropriate, like buckets of water with sunflower seeds on them for chipmunks. Sometimes that works. It's not very nice, but it does work. Spotted lantern flies. That is an entirely different, I can't talk to you about that because we have really limited time. So we're gonna kind of focus on berry crops right now. And hopefully you folks will be able to get some information about spotted lanternfly because it is a really important pest. So now we're going to move into caneberries and growing brambles. We've got, they're native here. We have lots and lots of blackberries that are all over the place. They're all different kinds of genuses. They're genus rubus. There's a lot of cross, they can cross-pollinate, and we can get a lot of different hybrids. They're all in the rosaceous family, just like strawberries. And you can get black, red, yellow, purple. Those are all raspberries. Blackberries are a different subgenus, and they can actually be crossed with raspberries. You get a loganberry, which is kind of an interesting thing. The big difference between a blackberry and a raspberry is blackberries have they're huge plants, big canes. The center of the fruit is filled with the core, the receptacle, and in a raspberry, whether it's red, yellow, black, purple, the receptacle stays on the plant. It doesn't come off. So the berry is hollow. So this is going to be a little confusing if you're not familiar with these plants, but we have two different types we're talking about raspberries right now, not blackberries, two different types of raspberries. We have summer fruiting raspberries, which are called floricane fruiting because it has a second year. So basically in a summer fruiting, you plant the plants in the spring, it goes through that first year. There's very little fruiting at all. And then it goes through a chilling, which is the winter, has to have the chilling. And then that second year in that original cane that came up, which is now called a floricane. It's first called a primocane in the first year, second year is called a floricane. And that's when it really puts out a lot of fruit because the buds have been laid in the fall, goes through a chilling, and boom, you have fruit. And these new primocanes come up, and you remove the old fruited cane, the floricane, and you have the process repeat itself. There's lots of different variation, red, yellow, black, purple. And then with the fall fruiting berries, you plant them in the spring. It takes a little bit longer, but chilling is not required, and you have fall fruit on that primocane. The primocane is then removed, usually, although it doesn't have to be, but for ease of management, it's usually removed. And then you have new primocanes come up. Sometimes some people will let that same primocane come through, fruit again early in the season before these other primocanes come up and fruit in the fall. And that's just, it's a little harder to manage, I think, and it gets a little bit wonky. The thing that's happening now is we're doing so much breeding that now we have varieties that will do a little bit of everything. They'll have fruit in the latter part of the year, and then they'll start fruiting again on that older cane, and then they have the new canes that come up, and the floricane is actually really good. So it's hard to tell. And this is one of the things when I train master gardeners, I think this is the hardest thing to answer a homeowner's question. It's like, oh my gosh, how do I manage these? I don't even know what kind they are, and really starting fresh. So if you're a grower, make sure you understand what you're buying so that you understand how you're going to manage these plants. And that will help a lot for down the road. Make sure you know what the variety's name is. Make sure you get it from a good nursery, the whole 9 yards. Because there's a lot of different varieties, fall fruiting, summer fruiting, lots and lots of options. So again, that planting and prepping, really, it needs a lot of sun. These plants need a lot of sun. They don't need any standing water, super bad. They have more flexibility from a pH standpoint. So that's a good thing, but you really want to make sure you get hardy, disease-resistant cultivars. You're going to purchase this plant material as these dormant cuttings. So again, this was dug in the fall, the cuttings were made, then they're stored in a cooler, and you transplant them out in the spring. And you can get 1 or 2 year old red and yellow raspberries. There is a great nursery in Massachusetts that you can order from that does a lot of work with strawberries and raspberries. You can get tissue cultured plants, which are definitely, the nice thing about them is that they are indexed, they're scored for their virus. They're free of virus, which gives you an extra couple of years, hopefully, in good viability. If you're doing tip layering of black and purple raspberries, that is something you can very easily do to kind of fill in rows. That's another way to propagate plants. Basically, your same kind of thing as a strawberry plant in the spring. You do want to do a little tipping of black and purple. We'll talk about that. That's of the cane itself, so that you can get more branching and more fruiting areas. Fertilizing, again, I'm not going to concentrate on that because I'm hoping that many of you are going to work towards an organic sensibility. I think a lot of customers want that. And that means using organic fertilizers and pre-applying it so that as it becomes available to the plants, kind of as it mineralizes, it becomes available, and you're doing less kind of synthetic fertilizer side dressing. So some of the trellising that we use for the floricane, the summer fruiting plants, is just a V trellis. The top wire is about 4 feet high. The bottom wire is about 2 feet high. You get about 3.5 feet across. They're kind of angled so that there's a V. Using some either wire or some plastic coated kind of twine will help it last a little longer. And the nice thing about that is that you're able to pull the fruiting canes out to the side. The primocanes can come up in the middle of that plant. See, look at that diagram, so that you can better control it. And it really helps reduce the interference among the canes. It makes harvesting easier. And it prevents those canes from flopping over and being on the ground. So having a trellis is very helpful. So pruning and trellising is important. In the early spring, we want to kind of clean up these plantings so that we've got better air movement. This is a purple or black raspberry, and they get cut back so that they've got not as much of that long vining growth. So red raspberries, you're looking for 3 to 4 canes per linear foot of row, and the row should be no more than 12 inches wide. So that means that in a square foot, you're going to have 4 or 5 canes per square foot. That's it. And then you just want to get rid of all the old canes. Just try to improve the air movement. And that's kind of a March, like sometime late February or March, especially for your area. You can usually get in and do that. Then these black and purple raspberries. So you plant them in the spring, and that first summer, you're going to tip them a bit, just a couple inches off of the top. What that does is it removes that source of auxin, which prevents, it kind of inhibits lateral bud break. So you take that off. It's just like pinching a, oh, Laura, any kind of ornamental plant, coleus, that's what I was trying to think. If you're pinching coleus, all the lateral buds break, same thing here. And you get all this other fruiting area. And then you're going to want to come along and kind of prune that back a bit. You still have these laterals, which is great, but you want to prune that back so that they can, not get overgrown, and you can kind of take care of them a little bit easier. So you're pruning and trellising, fertilizing, weeding, and doing a little bit of harvesting. You can harvest a little bit that first year, and then basically keep irrigating as much as you can throughout the season in a well-drained area, but don't get the foliage wet. So those are just a couple of things. And then fall bearing, you're going to do the same kind of thing, but you're going to start harvesting that very first fall. And you can come right after harvest or in the spring and just cut everything down, as long as you know that you don't want to have fruit any earlier than, like, say, the 2nd, 3rd week of August. That's usually when we start seeing primocane berries fruit. I don't think this is used very often, but I should throw it because it is an option. And if you've got really vigorous plants, it might be helpful. But this is a removable trellis. so that you can just have twines kind of there, some rebar that's been welded together to hold that in place. It does help with keeping a very vigorous planting from popping over, but most of the varieties in my mind tend to be pretty rigid. They don't flop over that much. One of the biggest problems we have with caneberries are mosaic virus, ring spot, a bunch of different viruses now that cause crumbly berries and those mottling. And that's one of the reasons why I really discourage people from digging up raspberry plants or blackberry plants from an older planting. You just don't want to do that because you're moving the virus around. It's bad enough that it's going to be transmitted by insects, but you don't need to, dig up old plantings thinking that, oh, you're going to save a bunch of money. I would always buy new stock. Fungal diseases, again, Phytophthora, verticillium, these are the soil-borne diseases that we really are struggling with. And poor soil quality, not good crop rotation, and poor drainage really, kind of promote these diseases. And then insect pests like raspberry cane borer, their spider mites can be a real problem, especially if you're growing in a high tunnel. Spider mites are really challenging. We also have brown marmorated stink bug, and they do love blueberry or raspberries, unfortunately. So that's something to keep your eye on. They're not as big a problem as for tree fruit and some vegetables, but they still will be an issue. But this is the insect that's most problematic, especially for raspberries. They will infest all soft fruit. So every berry that we talk about is in that category, except maybe cranberry. But every soft fruit, even cherries, will run the risk of being infested by this. It's an invasive fruit fly. It has a very rigid ovipositor that lays eggs, even in really good quality fruit, and causes the fruit, once those eggs hatch and this larvae hops out, it causes the fruit to degrade. And it's just really a bad deal. And so we've been doing a lot of monitoring of that insect and using exclusion netting, which is like frost protection row cover, but it's even, well, it's not any finer, but it's actually allows more air movement. It's more durable. It will last for 10 years if you care for it well, during the winter. And that really prevents, insects from getting in there. It also allows you to not have to use a pesticide. There are organic pesticides that can be used for spotted wing Drosophila, but if you don't want to spray at all, really insect exclusion, in my mind, is your only way that you're going to get ahead of this pest. There is some evidence for some predators that are kind of getting, they're getting established, so that's a really good thing. Okay, any quick questions about raspberries or blackberries? Do you recommend undersowing raspberry patches with anything to help with weed suppression? Yes, you could put some clover in there. People have been doing that, and that really does work. I think you're still going to have to mow it. And I don't think it'll outcompete because raspberries actually don't need that much nitrogen. All of these berry crops are not particularly aggressive feeders, so it isn't that big a deal. I think possibly some of the worst thing is if you get too much fertility there and you end up compromising your fruiting capacity over vegetative capacity. For fall fruiting raspberries, when you say mow or cut after harvest, cut low, because even if you leave a 6-inch stub, those what happens is that cane itself is seeing that it's got the chilling, and it's going to send out these really low fruit bracts, which you don't want. You want, if you're going to cut it and you're going to manage it as a fall crop, you want that low growing early stuff to not be there. So cut it really low in those primocane varieties. Honey Eye and Blu-ray pre-order. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Jen. Honey Eye is an old variety. It's a soft variety. So if you're growing things for a market where you want to have a little bit of shelf life, I would not recommend Honey Eye, but Blu-ray is a great one. So that's great. Great to hear. Okay, let's keep moving. We'll talk about blueberries. Blueberries are not any of these. We're going to be talking about the ericaceous plants. And we've got a lot of different blueberries, especially for you folks. You can probably go, mostly we're growing what we call northern high bush blueberries. And those would be hardy from about zone 8 to zone 4. Then we have some of these half high blueberries. They're a cross between low bush blueberries, which are grown in Maine, and they're a wild type, but that are kind of managed, and then crossed with these high bush blueberries. And these are these half high blueberries. They're shorter in stature, maybe only about 4 foot high, and they tend to have slightly smaller berries. They have really good, you know how some people will say that the low bush blueberries have a much more blueberry flavor. And I think that's true, that's transmitted to these half-high hybrids. And then these are some other, northern high bush. In your region, you might even be able to grow some of the southern high bush varieties, which would be kind of interesting. There's a few varieties that have really good fruit quality. The big thing about blueberries is that while they don't require to be outcrossed or have cross-pollination, this is the fruit size difference that if these are self-pollinated, one variety is just crossing with the own variety. So if you have more than one variety, you'll have cross-pollination and you get a lot larger fruit. So definitely plan on planting at least 3 to 4 varieties at minimum, and that way you'll have cross-pollination happening. Again, do not plant in a wet spot. Make sure you prepare the soil. This is a picture of what happens when your pH is too high. You have something called iron chlorosis. It gets this really yellow foliage, and that means that your pH is too high. And once these plants are planted, it is extremely difficult to lower the soil pH to where it really needs to be, because sulfur is caustic. It'll burn your plants. So you might have to put a ton of sulfur onto an acre of ground, and that will burn the heck out of your plants. So all of this soil modification, the pH modification, needs to be done 1 to 2 years ahead of time. So do that pH test right away if you think you want to grow blueberries. Again, you usually buy 2 to 3 year old plants. A bare root is great. It takes them a while to get going. So sometimes we don't call a blueberry planting mature until the plants are 8 years old. So they might be 2 years old when you put them in the ground. Another 6 years later, you've finally got a mature planting. You're going to remove the buds the first year to try to get more vegetative growth. So these flower buds are removed. And fertilizing, I mean, you really, this is the tricky part. You can use manures, which is great for organic growers, or ammonium sulfate. You cannot use a nitrate fertilizer on blueberries because it tends to be kind of toxic. They don't like it, and you end up with root death. So ammonium sulfate, if you're going to use a conventional synthetic product, or a manure-based compost, or something where you're getting some kind of urea or ammonium fertilizer in there. So pruning basics. Don't hedge it. You want to prune early in the spring before the buds break. You start with removing disease, broken, dead branches. And then you think about the fact that that plant has to be 8 years old. That's a mature plant. Any branches that are older than 8 years means that they're too old. Their productivity is going to start dropping. So you want to remove the 8-year-old cane and keep newer canes coming. 2 new canes per year up to 8 years. So you've got 2 1-year-old canes, 2 2-year-old canes, 2 3-year-old canes, until so that you've got 16 canes of different ages. If you've got old large canes that are greater than 1 inch in diameter, get them out of there. And if you're trying to renovate a planting, you want to remove 20 to 30% a year and try to slowly renovate that planting that way. Here's some before and afters. It's a little hard to tell, but this is a young plant. So they've just kind of trimmed it up a little bit, taken some of that wood that's going to be just too low. I would dare say that there's still a lot they could take out, because in the beginning, remember, it's just like pruning a tree. If you've got a branch that's coming out that's only a foot off the ground, it's always going to be a foot off the ground, right? The new growth is coming, and the height is coming from the top of the plant. So here's a good before and after. You're pruning way low. You want to really thin out some of that old stuff in the middle. These low branches that are going to be shaded anyway, they're going to be problematic. Get them out of there and prune low. With a blueberry plant, just like with the raspberries, you want to prune them low. Some of the fungal diseases, mummyberry is one of the ones that once you get it into a planting, it is super hard to get rid of it. There are these fruit become mummified, and they hang on to during the harvest, then they drop later in the season, and they have this little fruiting mushroom called an apothecia that will pull back and spring, and all these spores come out. So one way to really easily organically control this is make sure that you're replenishing your mulch in the spring. So you cover up those old apothecia. They don't have chance. Or if you're not replenishing every single year, you come in and you move that mulch around. You really try to discourage this little guy from actually getting a foothold and fruiting. Other canker diseases are fungal, they're fungal pathogens that cause them. Fusicoccum, phomopsis. They can cause what looks like winter injury. So it's usually from the tip back, it'll die. But a lot of times when these cankers really hit is in the summer, and you'll notice what we call flagging. Well, you'll get this dead branch all of a sudden, and it'll kind of be willy-nilly all over the planting. That's canker, and that needs to be pruned out. What is normal is this twig redness in a blueberry. It gets red, it'll have some mottling. That is totally normal, but dieback is not normal. For blueberries, one of the biggest problems we have are birds, which I want to point out that spotted wing Drosophila netting, that exclusion netting, also prevents bird damage. It prevents hail damage. It prevents heavy rain damage because it disperses the rain as it comes through that netting. So there's a lot of other things about that exclusion netting that's super helpful. And here's just a picture of a trickle hose. Probably most of you know what that looks like. This is a non-food safety picture of bird control, which is not necessarily what we want to use, or rely on rather. Okay, it's 1:13. I'm going to just try to cover very quickly rabies and elderberries, and then answer some questions about all of these. Keys to success with rabies, they're super heavy feeders. And unlike blueberries, you want to remove the 4-year-old canes because they actually get quite vegetative, pruning them annually in the spring. Growing rabies is now legal. It used to be illegal because it's the alternate host for white pine blister rust, but currants and gooseberries are legal to grow as long as you avoid susceptible black currant varieties. And if you happen to be, you're thinking about growing in the Catskills or the Adirondacks, those are what we call their non-fruiting zones, and you have to register with DEC if you're going to grow a rabies plant. But resistant or immune black currants like Titania, Benserrac, Coronet, Crusader are available. And then there's red and white currants and pink currants that are really fabulous, really great. There's a lot of American or European varieties of gooseberries. Gooseberries have quite substantial thorns on them. That's just one thing to think about when you're considering growing something. But these fruits are really widely prized by certain especially Eastern European folks, they really like them. And they're hard to find. Again, you're pruning out the oldest cane, and you want to keep a couple of canes for each year, but 4 years old. So you're going to keep 2 or 3 or 4 3-year-olds, 2 or 3 or 4 2-year-olds, 2 or 3 or 4 1-year-old, and you're going to have a nice type of planting. Anthracnose or leaf spot can be a problem. Current aphids are really problematic. They cause this kind of it almost looks like a virus, doesn't it? But it caused that kind of blistering. And then elderberries are another really good plant or berry crop that I would encourage. They are susceptible to spotted wing because they have a lot of fruit in the fall of the year. So the later in the season that you get, like fall bearing raspberries, or particularly some of the blackberries that bloom late blueberries, elderberries. That's, usually I think of spotted wing Drosophila as really getting geared up. There's so many of them around by about the second week of August, and a little bit earlier down where you are. But then it's really hard to keep them under wraps. So if you're you don't want to put up exclusion netting, you want to grow berries, you don't want to use any kind of chemicals for spotted wing Drosophila, I would really try to grow things that fruit early in the season, and then you can hopefully get away without being bothered by them. Elderberries have a lot of really cool ornamental uses. They have a wide variety of pH. They're pretty adaptable. You need 2 cultivars for good fruit set. They're big plants. They have to be planted fairly far apart, adequately watered. But yeah, this is let's stop sharing. I'm going to go take you to this website, and then we'll try to answer the questions as we go. Let me look. Do you recommend pruning arching red? Yes. If they're looking leggy, A, they're probably got too much shade, and B, they need to be pruned. I recommend pruning everything as much as possible. The more you prune, the better your plants are going to be. And 6A and 6B, yeah, it doesn't matter where you are. I really wonder if you've got arching and weak plants, as A, they don't have enough sunlight, and B, maybe they do need a little bit of more fertility. If your gooseberries branched out horizontally and hugging the ground, yes, anything on the ground, get rid of it. Get rid of it. And then if you think you need to trellis something because that particular variety, put some posts in there and try to tie it to the post to keep it upright. That might be, Brooke, your problem might be that your cultivar is just a funny one. So we'd have to figure that out. All right, let me go quickly to this website that I want to make sure. This website is called the Cornell Fruit Resources. This is where we try to catalog things for growers. And it's for berries. If you notice up here, berries, grapes, and tree fruit. So there's all kinds of information there for commercial growers. That's you guys. So let's go to the berries. We're going to and in here, we've got all kinds of things. Weed identification, best management, not necessarily that important anymore for COVID-19, but there's some really good tips that you pickers have kept. Tons of spotted wing Drosophila information. Let me go first to this nursery guide for berry and small fruit crops. This is super helpful. You can get all these different cultivars. There's tons and tons of different cultivars that let's pick blackberries. You can go down, pick, what do you want, a thorny blackberry? Do you want a thornless blackberry? We didn't talk a ton about that. You want a trailing blackberry? Let's look for blackberry raspberry hybrids. There they are. There's loganberry, dewberry, boysenberry. All of those are hybrids. Then the really cool thing is that here is a link to the nursery. Magnolia, that didn't link exactly the way I had hoped, but here we go. Oh, they don't have a website, but Magnolia gives you the email to the person. Let's say that Lassen Canyon is the one we were looking for. There's the link. You can go directly to the website, check out availability, check out prices. This is growers should use this more. It's so helpful. It really is helpful. So let me show you the other thing. I'm going to just keep going back. We're going to look at this berry diagnostic tool. This is also really helpful. So let's say we've got some problems in our blueberries. We're trying to figure out how, first of all, you could call me because you're in my region. So that's one thing. But if for some reason I don't answer and you want to do a little detective work, let's say that your canes are wilting, collapsing, dead, or turning brown. And let's say, oh, it might be canker disease. Laura mentioned canker disease. This is what canker flagging looks like in the summer, is that all of a sudden you get these kind of sporadic individual canes. And then there's some more information about the different types of canker, lots of pictures, mostly cutting that out of there is the way to get, but that's kind of nice, right? That you can actually go in and find that. So that website is fruit.cornell.edu. That'll get you to that website. All right, let me see. Thank you, Ruby, for sharing that. Are there any more questions about the fruit? I mean, I just covered the big ones, right? In the handout that you're going to get, there's some more minor fruit information. We're doing a beginning farmer online class through Cornell Small Farms. It's a 6-week course focused entirely on uncommon fruit, and that starts in late February. You have to register for that through the Cornell Small Farms program. And if you're interested in those types of fruit, we're going to have lots of commercial growers and more information about the culture of that. I feel like that's a really broad brush for commercial growers, but at least it gives you a little bit of idea of how to care for some of these plants. And if you are a commercial grower, you know, reach out to me, email me. That's usually the best, especially in the winter. Send me an email. I work out of my house a lot. My cell phone is not very good here. So why not, you're welcome to email me. But are there any other questions? We've got about 10 minutes or so before we have to wrap it up.
I think there's one in the chat and then I've got one as well.
So Brooke, that is a great question and a frequent type of question. So think about how this cross-pollination happens. If you have pink or red and they share pollen, the fruit, which is maternal tissue. So the fruit itself is always on that plant, is always going to be what the plant is. If you saved seed from that fruit, that would possibly turn out to something totally different. But you have to save the seed because the seed is the result of the cross. The fruit is always maternal. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. A cutting from that plant is always maternal as well. And that's why in the nursery business worldwide, they usually, unless they're conducting a breeding program, but if they're just they're just making more of a plant, it's always from vegetative cuttings, which is why if you get a vegetative cutting is taken for those this is why I have to retire. I can't think of things. It's a tissue culture plant. You take the vegetative cutting, you grow that callus. You just take little pieces of the plant, you grow the callus out. You're screening it for virus all the time, but it's grown. It has little roots, it has little top. But that is still vegetative. They do not take a seed, and because the seed could be totally different, right? But in a breeding program, you're allowing the seed to germinate, then you evaluate it over time. It takes forever. In a perennial plant, especially fruit that take a while before they get past their juvenile period, it takes forever to evaluate the crop. And yeah, that's why That's why there aren't very many breeding programs out there. It's a big resource, the big investment. Any other questions?
I was just wondering if you could speak about the benefits or pros and cons of a thornless variety and thorn variety.
Like in the blackberries? So interestingly enough, I always find this really interesting. So for some reason, hardiness seems to be linked with thorniness, which is sad, right? So blackberries often, but not always, are often a little bit hardier if they're a thorned variety. However, we have managed to, Arkansas especially has a great blackberry breeding program. And so they have been breeding, and then they'll pitch out some of their stuff that they don't like as much to some of the northern. Cornell does have a caneberry breeding program. Courtney Weber is the breeder. And so they take some of that germplasm and try to work with it. So blackberries, we still haven't gotten a fully hardy blackberry for all of New York, but there are lots of people that if you looked at those sites where they're kind of sheltered sites along bodies of water, you definitely can get blackberries to perform. And our winters are so wacko now that we aren't getting those really super cold temperatures. So I would say blackberries, thornless blackberry varieties, are probably a good bet for you guys in Putnam County. And I would say that because very few of the other growers in the rest of the state can grow them, you're going to be competing with New Jersey and Pennsylvania a little bit, and probably Long Island, but not upstate. So if you've got some folks that are bringing stuff down to green markets and the city, they're rarely got enough blackberries to pull down there. So blackberries, I think, are a good bet.
That's great. I'm just gonna throw the final poll in before people start hopping off while you take that last if you want to.
Sure. Pawpaws, I don't know very much about pawpaws. If Anya Osatuk is my colleague who's in Western New York, she really is the pawpaw person. We do on that website, there is a little brand new management guide for pawpaws, and pawpaws are definitely going to be covered in our uncommon fruit, not by me, but by someone else. I don't know. I think cultivars are really hard to come by because the breeding programs are mostly from growers. I don't know of any commercial nursery that's got a pawpaw breeding program, and it's definitely not being done by, unless it's just some hobby kind of approach by a land grant university. They just don't have the resources to do that, such a minor fruit. But there's a ton of interest in pawpaws. People are super psyched about pawpaws. So I just, one of the things that I've heard from growers who are trying to get plant material is that like they'll go ahead and purchase, they'll place their order, and then in the spring, the order fails because they don't have the plant material. It's super frustrating. So if you are trying to get pawpaws, I would put orders into several different nurseries in hopes that you can kind of hedge your bets and get something. It is really difficult to get pawpaw plant material. Yeah. Any other questions? You guys are a great group. I wish you luck, and I really hope that you do pursue growing berry crops because we need more berry growers. They're tricky. They're tough. There's no getting around it. They're not for the faint of heart, but they are really good food and people want them, and I think you can make some money on them. All right.
That's great. Thank you, Laura, and thank
You're
you,
very
everyone.
welcome.
And
Bye. Happy New Year, folks.
bye. I'll send out the presentation and the links that Laura mentioned throughout this as well. So thank you all for joining. And I'll just close everything up.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.